this? Government. It belongs to everyone, and it has a unique relationship with each of us. Government is the only institution that we all must deal with, like it or not, through every phase of life from birth to death. For most people, government services are just a necessary hassle. We deal with them only because we have to. Accessing government services feels burdensome, costly, inefficient, time-consuming, as if governments are stuck in a different century from the one we live in. But what if there were a better way? Imagine registering the birth of your child from your hospital bed. What if keeping your kids healthy was a paperless transaction? What if registering a business could be done from the comfort of your home? What if connecting our kids' classrooms to the internet could connect them to their fullest potential? Shouldn't all of our transactions with government be this simple? What if we use technology to create an open road to the future? The Caribbean Telecommunications Union recognizes that the evolution of information and communication technologies presents the opportunity to create an information profile of each citizen. Caribbean governments can effectively use this to accelerate and fully implement e-government services and transform the public service to deliver a better quality of life for our people. Caribbean people will transact business, stay informed, stay connected, be engaged, anytime, anywhere. This is government for the 21st century. Our future has arrived.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today at the RNCTU webinar series, Accelerating 21st Century Government in the Caribbean. This is a webinar series jointly hosted by ARIN, American Registry for Internet Numbers, and CTU, the Caribbean Telecommunications Union. My name is Stephen Lee, Program Director of the Caribbean Network Operators Group, or CARIBNOG. This is our fourth session in the webinar series, which is part of a regional conversation towards aligning government and civil society with the technology advances in the 21st century. We've been covering a number of topics related to this, and this is our fourth and final in the series. Before we get started today, I wanted to show you around so that you can participate successfully. As we interact, I would like you to introduce yourself in the chat in this order, giving your first name, last name, organization, and the country where you're based. For example, I would be Stephen Lee, Program Director at CARIBNOG, based in the USA. The chat button is located at the bottom of your screen, excuse me. During the presentations, you can post your questions in the Q&A section button next to chat, labeled Q&A. And this is also at the bottom of the screen. Aaron and the CTU ask that attendees be guided by the code of conduct of both organizations while in the chat and Q&A. Violations of the code of conduct will result in your removal of the offender from the webinar. We'd like to have a very safe and open environment here in our webinar. The theme for this webinar, webinar in the series is network safety for network security for public safety in a 21st century government environment. And we have three speakers who have joined us today. We have Chris Painter. He's a cyber diplomat at the Global Commission on the Security of Cyberspace. And Mr. Painter is also president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. He will be covering the topic, cybersecurity beyond COVID-19, network security trends and challenges, looking at a global picture. We're also joined by Karen Barnett. She's a cybersecurity policy specialist at the Organization of American States. Ms. Barrett will be talking about Caribbean cybersecurity issues, cybersecurity and public safety parity in considerations. So this is a regional perspective. Then finally, we have with us today Listening Dobile, Senior Director, Trust and Public Policy at ARIN, American Registry for Internet Numbers. And Ms. Nobile will be speaking to us about protecting infrastructure, applications, assets, and personnel, given the regional internet registry's perspective on this. I won't read their bios, as we've had the information as part of the pre-webinar slides, and everyone is welcome to look at that in more detail as we post on the website. I'm now going to invite Chris to begin his presentation on cybersecurity beyond COVID-19, looking at global network security trends and challenges. We will have approximately 15 minutes for each session. At the end, we will have a general discussion and open it up for Q&A with everyone. So welcome again, everyone. And Chris, ask you to go ahead.
Thanks very much. And it's great to be here with all of you today. I wish we were somewhere, not virtually, but together somewhere, but that doesn't seem to be the reality these days. You know, in addition to being a diplomat and being the president of the Foundation for the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, I've been dealing with cyber in various capacities, including public safety capacities as a prosecutor for over 25 years. So I've seen the evolution of the threats, but also our dependency on cyberspace. And although the topic of my talk is supposed to be beyond COVID-19, I think I have to, as most of us do, start with COVID-19. Because I think COVID-19 illustrates a couple of important international trends. One, it really illustrates how dependent we are on all these technologies. That as we have been forced to do almost everything online, from seminars to our daily work schedule to interacting with friends, that means that those platforms are even more vulnerable to intrusions, attacks, disruptions, and vulnerabilities. So COVID-19 really illustrates how fragile our ecosystem is and how important it is to protect it. And I think that there's a two-edged sword on this. One is it illustrates some of the threats of those systems, but also some of the opportunities. The threats, I think, are clear. There's a lot that's going on. It was recently noted that the U.S. and the U.K. and other countries around the world have warned of an increasing use of malicious actors, cyber malicious actors, using COVID-19 as a platform. And this has happened in two ways. And it's really not that surprising to me, especially as a former prosecutor. Every time there was some bad thing that happened, whether it be a hurricane or any kind of humanitarian crisis, especially criminal groups would be quick to capitalize on that. But we've also seen nation states acting, trying to disrupt or steal information, and that's raised real concerns. So the threats are certainly real, and they've also raised some questions about how do we protect critical infrastructure, including our national health systems and our hospitals, which I'll talk about a little later. But the opportunity, I think, is that because this illustrates so directly why we're so dependent on these technologies, countries around the world small and large countries are realizing that cybersecurity is important. And that's important because in my long career, although cybersecurity has engaged more and more and folks have understood why this is important, it still hasn't grabbed hold as enough at the political level, where it's a political priority for countries at the presidential, the prime minister, the congressional levels, where this is really among the top things we need to think about. So hopefully COVID-19 will move this into action to have more political buy-in. In terms of the threats we're seeing, I've seen these threats evolve. I think we all have, and become much more serious as we become much more dependent on these technologies. We've seen threats from different threat actors, criminal groups, lone criminals, transnational criminal groups, nation states. We've seen a lot of threats from nation states as well. And we've seen a variety of different threats too. Theft of information, whether it be proprietary information or other information, personal information, computer attacks that are disruptive, and more countries around the world many more countries are developing military capabilities in cyberspace, which has the potential to disrupt or to make cyberspace less stable. So we have all these actors. We've had some good things that have happened, to be sure, that, for instance, there has been, as we look again at the range of actors, this has increased over time. It used to be the criminal groups are the most active. Now we see nation states, criminal groups, and others sometimes acting together. Sometimes nation states are using criminal groups as proxies. And it's become far more serious as we become more dependent on these technologies. And we've seen some pretty big events. One, the NotPetya worm that was launched back about 1.5 years ago that had major effects on international commerce around the world. The WannaCry worm, which disrupted the national health system in the UK. And I should note that these kinds of attacks and these threats and the theft of information are not just targeted at big countries. They're targeted at small countries too. And they risk, I think, undermining a lot of the economic development those countries can have. So that also puts a premium on cybersecurity, but I don't think those activities have been enough to push it into the political limelight. So against that backdrop, we have seen, I think, a fair amount of good activity, both nationally and internationally. More countries around the world have done the foundational thing of having a national strategy. And I expect some of the other speakers will expand a little bit on this. Many countries in this region, for instance, now have national strategies, though not all of them. A national strategy is something that prioritizes cybersecurity as a key goal and talks about how you organize. And a critical part of a national strategy also talks about how you cooperate internationally. So that's really important. Another aspect is building institutions, things like national certs, again, national and regional certs. Again, there's been a lot of activity in this region. OAS, CTU, and others have been working hard on that, and I expect you'll hear more about that. And there's also the greater need, not just to act nationally, although nationally helps international cooperation, to prioritize international cooperation because, as I said earlier, the threats we're seeing that are only increasing, both in number and severity, are almost always transnational threats. When I was a prosecutor, even if someone was a hacker trying to attack, someone 3 blocks away, they would route their communications through other countries to make it harder to find them. And that's true, I think, for all of us, no matter where we are in the world. We're seeing that happen. And we need to have those people, whether they be nation states or criminals, we need to hold them accountable. And I'll talk about that more in a moment, too. So it's very important to enhance our international cooperation on several different levels. On the level of technical level between computer emergency response teams, on the law enforcement level between police and prosecutors, and on the political level among countries. And we need to do more of that. And I think there has been some good initiatives there, but we need to do more. One thing that this illustrates for me is the real importance of capacity building as an underlying foundational element. So I think it's fair to say countries around the world are at different levels of dealing with these issues, of recognizing these issues, of prioritizing these issues, and frankly, having the capacity to deal with these issues, to have the institutions in place, the resources, the training. And again, I think there's been really good regional efforts, which I'll leave to others to describe, including Carrie Ann from the OAS. But one of the things I do now is I run or help run a global group that is dedicated to capacity building. The Global Forum for Cyber Expertise is dedicated to doing capacity building around the world and to coordinate the capacity building. So there's lots of different efforts around the world that are trying to address these issues. I would argue they're not getting enough resources or priority. And the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise is trying to bring all those different stakeholders together, whether they're countries that need help or countries or other stakeholders like industry, the multi-stakeholder group, industry, civil society, and others who can provide that help. We've launched a portal of all the documents that are out there that can, and best practices that can help countries. We have a matchmaker function to help match those countries who need help. We have 5 working groups that include things like international security and diplomacy, which is one important aspect I'll address in a moment. Incident response, cybercrime, standards, awareness and education. All these are critically important, and I would encourage folks who are on the call to become familiar with that organization. I think we have a good website. We have doing a lot of activities. Many of the people on this call are involved in that, and so I think that's been very helpful. So that organization has done a lot of the capacity building or work to help strengthen capacity building, but it also has worked on the international dimension. Countries not only need to build these institutions domestically, but as I said, involve themselves in international cooperation on a tactical level, but also be involved in the international discussions that are happening now, and this is what I'll turn to next, on international security in cyberspace, what the rules of the road are in cyberspace. That cyberspace is not a free fire zone. It's not an empty space where everyone can do everything, where it's the wild, wild west or the wild, wild web, as some people have said it. There are indeed rules in cyberspace, and we need to think about that. So there's been a lot of activity, particularly in the UN, but also in other organizations, including the Global Commission that I'm a part of, that has been looking at what are the rules of the road in cyberspace. You know, one is that international law applies in cyberspace just like it does in the physical world. One is that there are certain norms of behavior, voluntary rules of the road, things like don't attack the infrastructure of another country during peacetime, don't attack the CERTs, the computer emergency response teams. They're like the ambulance at the hospitals on the internet, so don't go after them, and how countries should cooperate. And as I said earlier, one of the things this is illustrated is with attacks that are happening on healthcare systems and hospitals, that itself is a critical infrastructure or election systems that we need to focus on. So there's been a lot of work done on what international law applying, what the norms or rules of the road are, and then finally, confidence building measures, ways that countries can cooperate and communicate with each other to make sure they de-escalate potential conflict. As I said, there's a couple of different processes that are happening now in the UN. Countries around the world, including countries both in the West and the East, China, Russia, the US, the UK, many countries in this region as well, Brazil and others have agreed that certain norms should apply, including the ones I talked about. And that's important. And now they're trying to take that work forward in something called the Open-Ended Working Group in the UN, which is all countries around the world, and every country in this region as well, and something called the Group of Governmental Experts, which is a smaller group of countries that are looking at these issues and has met on prior occasions. But I think the important thing about that is these are critical discussions. As I said, as cyberspace is becoming less stable because we're seeing more attacks, we're seeing more military use in cyberspace, it's important to think about what these rules of the road should be. And it's important for countries, including in this region, to be very involved in that. There's another aspect of this, which is cybercrime. There's also some UN activity in cybercrime. There is something called the Budapest Convention for Cybercrime, which is the gold standard for cybercrime laws. Certainly, countries around the world should join that. There's been a recent effort to have another treaty in the UN to deal with this. That's going to take practically forever, in my view, and not be very effective, but we'll see what happens. But it's no excuse to sit on your hands and not do things now, not join the Budapest Convention, or make sure you have the training and expertise. So there's a lot that can be done now, whatever happens in the future. And the final two things I want to discuss in this kind of whirlwind overview of what's happening is, the issue of accountability. So we talk a lot about norms. We talk about rules of the road. We talk about cybercrime laws, and those are all important to helping protect all of us. But if there's no accountability, then those are just words on paper. So if I'm a criminal and I never get prosecuted or arrested, I will act with impunity because there's no cost to me. If I'm a nation state and I do bad things and there's no consequences, there's nothing that happens to me, I'll keep doing those bad things. And worse yet, other countries that are thinking about malicious actions will also dive in and do those too. So we need to create not just the rules of the road, whether they be cybercrime rules or norms of behavior for states, but make sure there's accountability for them. And I think we've done a pretty terrible job at that so far. And I hope that we become much better in making sure that there are consequences, things like sanctions, things like countries acting together in collective groups to sanction bad actors. We need to make cyberspace a safer place for all of us because it is the engine of economic and social growth. And then the final thing I wanted to touch on is the importance of what I used to do and still involved in, the international diplomacy aspect. So there are the technical experts, there are the policy experts, they're the criminal law experts and prosecutors and judges and agents. But diplomacy and diplomats are critically important as well, because this is becoming, as I said, not just a technical issue. You know, it used to be when you went into a minister's office or a president's office and you talked about cybersecurity, their eyes would roll back in their head and they would want to run away and say, that's a technical issue. But now it's becoming more of a political issue. So diplomacy is important to make sure we can work with other countries, to make sure they have the capabilities, that they can all work together, and that we could work together to fight these threats that we see that are only growing and become more effective. If we don't do that, I'm afraid that all the good work we've done and all the promise of the internet will be undermined. So with that, I will stop. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to answering questions later on in the program.
All right, great. Thank you, Chris. There's a really great overview of the global situation. We'll be able to take questions and have comments on Chris's presentation when we get to the Q&A section. I invite you to start posting your questions now. The Q&A button is at the bottom of the screen, and we'll just have them queued up, ready to go when we get into that section of the webinar. To now look at the regional picture, I'm going to invite Carrie-Ann Barrett to start presenting, and she'll be looking at Caribbean cybersecurity and public safety priority considerations. Carrie-Ann?
Thank you, Stephen, and good morning again, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My idea for the presentation is to give you a general overview as to some of the current threats in the region for cybersecurity, and also to tell you some of the things that the OAS as a regional body, what we're doing and how this has helped to build capacity to address some of those public safety concerns and some of the things that we should prioritize as the way forward. Just as a disclaimer that the thoughts expressed here, it's not those of the OAS member states, it's individual presenting. And I wanted to just describe for you generally that, as Chris has rightfully said, with the changing landscape right now that we have, a majority of us have been forced to go online. There are things that we never envisioned that we'd be doing online. And a lot of companies were forced automatically with the advent of COVID-19 to migrate a lot of their services, a lot of their data, their staff to a virtual setting, whether it be cloud computing. So work has become more digitized, and relationships have changed as well. Even us interacting now, where we're able to speak with you, and data and information is even available after this webinar. So persons who weren't able to be here can still access the information. So cybersecurity on a whole has generally changed to adapt to what the changing environment is. To give you a very good overview, we launched 2 days ago a cybersecurity report called Risk, Progress, and the Way Forward in Latin America and the Caribbean. This report was done in conjunction with the IDB, and the idea of this report was to assess the region at a more general level and provide for persons a very specific measurement as to what it is that their country is doing in cybersecurity and what is left that could be done to improve their capacity. This report was based on the cybersecurity capacity model developed by the Oxford University, and it measures a country on 5 dimensions. One of the things to highlight, though, is when you read this report, it will give you a very good snapshot as to where each country is in the region, what they're doing in terms of Dimension 1, cybersecurity policy and strategy, culture and society, Dimension 3, which covers cybersecurity education and training, Dimension 4, legal and regulatory frameworks, and standards and organizations and technologies. These 5 dimensions, as assessed or analyzed by Oxford, pretty much gives a country an idea as to the different areas that they could look at. It's divided by segments, indicators, and it gives a description as to how to build your capacity. Coming out of that report, we recognize that member states, since our 2016 report, have advanced in certain areas. What was key for this report, so you'll have an idea, is in the Southern Cone, we recognize that legal and regulatory frameworks had improved since the last report. In the Andean regions, there have been some progress with cybersecurity standards and technical controls. In Central America and Mexico, improvement was seen for culture, society, education, training, and skills. In the Caribbean, we had significant progress in legal and regulatory frameworks. It could have been attributed to a number of factors, such as the HIPCAR models, which were later adopted by a lot of member states, countries like Jamaica that had revised their cybercrime legislation, countries like Trinidad and Grenada, and even Guyana have approved their cybercrime acts. So you're actually seeing some progress being made in many of the countries in the Caribbean for legal and regulatory framework. On average, though, the document does show that there's important gaps in cybersecurity policy and strategy, which Chris spoke about as an important pillar to having cybersecurity as a top priority in any country. The average cyber maturity level of the region, however, like across the board, was between 1 and 2, which is initiating either cybersecurity best practices, or 2, now getting the hang of it. There are 5 levels of maturity. One of the things that we believe in is that we don't rank our member states against each other, but what we look at is that what are some of the important gaps that are common among many of our member states. And what we notice is that cybersecurity policy and strategy is something that has had great progress. And if you look at some of the main results from that report, 17 out of 32 countries have been promoting public policies and initiatives to actually strengthen cybersecurity. So there's a trend now for cybersecurity to be at the forefront of our member states' minds. Another thing is, in 2016, only 6 countries had developed national cybersecurity strategies. Today we have 12, with many, many more that are in progress, which I'll show you later in the presentation. 17 countries in the region has legislation that protects privacy of data of individuals. And why is this so important? With COVID-19 now impacting on cyber issues, there's a 50% increase in data traffic. That was not there before. We're seeing healthcare institutions being targeted, so data is now become like the new gold. So having privacy legislation is critical. We've also seen a 350% surge in phishing websites. And this is as a result of very specific targeted attacks at individuals. Other things that we've seen, which is not included in the report I just mentioned, but just general observations. With the COVID-19, we have seen an increase in the use of digital surveillance for contact tracing. And you might wonder, why is it that it seems as if there's actually this level of surveillance? A lot of governments have now recognized that in order to ease movement coming out of lockdowns and coming out of their countries being shut down and economies being affected, that one of the most useful tools they could have is actually to do contact tracing. This contact tracing does allow that individuals would have to give up some of their privacy. Some countries have utilized their cellular phones to be able to track persons. Some persons have downloaded the apps. Some persons have been doing it by actually reporting themselves to their medical facilities. In some countries, there have been evidence globally of human rights violations in an attempt to cause a lockdown, which is something that some persons were seeing violence, arrests. There was an increase in online and misinformation, which is happening globally. And there's been a reduction in counterterrorism as a priority. Governments in some countries have seen that they have to now focus their attention on their medical field, their medical sector, and have reduced some of the monies that they had for law enforcement and intelligence to be able to track some of the cyber threats that are arising. Why is the use of the internet for criminal purposes a challenge for us in LAC then, generally, taking into account that wide capacity framework that I spoke about, more specific COVID-related issues I spoke about, what we've noticed is that there are very few cyber incident response mechanisms, meaning that there are very few institutions set up at a national level to monitor networks, to actually coordinate responses to cyber that might actually affect a national level. There's low level of public awareness on online safety. CTU and Aaron doing this initiative is one of the great things when you have regional organizations, because you're able to reach a wider audience to raise this level, even at the regional level, while we work with our member states and various groups to be able to raise it at the national level. There are low levels of public-private collaboration and trust on cybersecurity issues. That includes information sharing. We believe at the OAS that information sharing is key. It's key because you are not in a pond by yourself. We're all fishes swimming in the same internet, and being able to share information on common threats would allow countries to be able to better respond. It shouldn't be that right next door in Antigua, there's something happening and there's no one in Grenada that knows about that. It shouldn't be that St. Lucia is left alone, not knowing what is happening in their neighboring country, and we all share the same network. Increased attacks using social engineering and targeting fears of citizens during the pandemic, especially right now, became evident. There's an institution called InsideCrime.org that actually reported that in Mexico and Guatemala, they saw incidences of persons being targeted with the lure in their phishing attacks that they would get COVID-19 testing or vaccines, or they would get a stimulus checks. There are other reports in Costa Rica where there was a ransomware called COVID Lock that would actually say to persons, hey, there's an interactive map you could download, and if you download it, you'll be able to see where the incidences of COVID was popping up so persons could avoid hotspots. And they would actually lock the person's devices and then ask them to provide Bitcoins as a reward to have their devices unlocked. That was coming out of a website called innovationatwork.org that provided that data. So you're seeing that globally, the issue of cybersecurity has always been a trend that needed to be addressed. But now we have layered on top of it this new COVID-19, which is a pandemic, which as the technology goes forward, we'll have other issues that would be impacting at a global level, not just a medical emergency. At the OAS, we have a regional approach. We have 3 sections that deals with cybersecurity, cybercrime in very specific ways. We have CTEL that would work with CTU in terms of having that telecommunications arm. We have REMHA, which addresses cybercrime and legislation, and you have CICTE, under which the cybersecurity program of the OAS sits. We currently have, as I spoke earlier, several countries that have been developing national cybersecurity strategies. I think Chris gave a very good overview as to why this is critical. But we have several that's in trend. We have countries such as Belize that is to be launched this year. We have Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Barbados, Guyana. We have other countries such as Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago that are thinking about revising their current strategies, given that things have changed in their country since the last time they did it. So the OAS's cybersecurity program goals then, if you use the policy above, is to actually support member states in the development of these technical documents. We also believe in the improving the exchange of information and cooperation, which is why we have what is called our CSERTs network, where we allow member states to be able to get real-time threat data daily on their networks, on their domain names, and give them information on attacks that may be coming up as a result of phishing, etc. We also believe in increasing knowledge and information about threats, which is why we've published several reports to be able to allow countries in the Caribbean and Latin America to be able to know what are some of the best practices and information that they can apply at the national level. With COVID, we did several webinars similar to this, and the information is still available. We spoke about teleworking, recognizing that with many of us, including governments, we've been paper-based for so many years, and then suddenly governments especially has been thrown into the world of digitization. In the video that was shown before we started, you recognize that moving to the 21st century as a working environment is something that is crucial to compete, not only regionally, but to compete in the wider scale of things. And it's something that the Caribbean cannot ignore in doing it. And having a safe way to do it is something that you consider, and there's always information available for that. We've done webinars that spoke about privacy, recognizing that digital transformation is key, but actually having the discussions of what are the differences in views, such as the conversation we had with millennials and centennials on these issues. There are reports that you could access, just so you know. We've done reports on the financial sector and on organizations that have been affected by cybersecurity. While limited in terms of some countries being able to coordinate stakeholders, you'd find that regional bodies such as CTU, such as the OAS, were able to actually coordinate at the national level and give support to governments to be able to get this information garnered and available to the general public. I wanted to close with just this slide that in terms of the way forward, we believe that it's important to recognize that many of our OAS member states, which includes all 13 English-speaking Caribbean countries, and then if you think about some of the other non-English-speaking countries in the region, there's progress that is being made. I think the fact that we're having this discussion and that persons are participating, they're logging on, they're listening, is a very good sign that cybersecurity is being prioritized. Another thing that we think is important going forward is cooperation and coordination at all levels. Without that, I'm thinking that the cybersecurity bubble, it's not just one entity that is impacted. You have multiple stakeholders that must be consulted at various levels for various activities. And we believe that finding a way to coordinate all of those entities and stakeholders to provide meaningful input into a cybersecurity resilient society is something that cannot be avoided. And it's something that would only, I guess, be the best approach for any government to do. On that note, I want to hand the floor back over to Stephen. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. So here we have a really good insight into what is happening inside of our region, tying it into the global trend and just looking specifically at how things are developing in the Caribbean or progress to date in this area. So hoping to have really good discussion around those things. We already have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Which we'll address at the when we get into our interactive session. For our final presentation today, I'm going to invite Leslie Nobile from ARN to give us the RIR Regional Internet Registry perspective on protecting infrastructure, applications, assets, and personnel. Just looking at public safety trends, responses, practices, being observed by the regional registry. So, Leslie.
Okay, I assume you can all hear me. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about cybersecurity and internet safety from an RIR perspective. I'm going to touch on ARN and the RIRs, who we are, what we do, but more importantly, how we work both individually and together to help the internet run more reliably, more securely. And I'll highlight some of the ways that our work helps to support law enforcement and their efforts to fight cybercrime and keep the public safe. So briefly, here are the 5 RIRs. The system was established in 1992. I'm not going to go through each one of these. You can see the year they were established and the regions that each of the 5 RIRs support. This was done in the beginning of the 90s as the internet started to grow and become more commercialized. There was a realization that there was a need for regionalization of the IP address functioning. So our core functions, I think most of you know, we manage, distribute, and register IPv4 and IPv6 addresses and autonomous system numbers. That's sort of the main thing that we do, but we have a lot of supporting services. So obviously we have to run a registry to put all of those internet number resources into. So we maintain directory services. Whois is the largest and probably the most important that contains all registration information. Whowas is the historical information that was formerly in Whois and that is now archived. And then we all run routing registries where route announcements and routing information is registered. We facilitate policy development process. It is a public process. The communities determine the policies, and the RIR staffs implement those policies. We provide reverse DNS delegations, and that is the action of translating an IP address into a domain name. We support the internet infrastructure through technical coordination, and that is done with our global industry partners and with each other. We want to make sure that the internet is running reliably and safely. And we provide technical capacity building. All 5 of the RIRs have extensive training, outreach, and engagement programs. So our most heavily utilized tool is Whois. And that is where all registration data is included. It is publicly displayed, and it includes the IP number resources that the RIRs issued and their predecessor registries issued. That was all done under US government contract in the 80s and early 90s. We register the organizations that are responsible for the number resources and their points of contact. We have customer reassignment information that we register. All 5 RIRs have a policy that require customer reassignments to be there, so you can actually see end user information. Some of the RIRs have policies that will allow their ISPs to hide some of their customer reassignment information. In the Erin region, you will actually see almost all customer reassignment information. We have the Whois also shows the original registration date of the net resource or the organization and the date it was last touched, that's last updated date, which can be pretty useful when you're doing research or investigations. We have referential information, so if you're going to one RIR and the data actually is contained in another RIR's Whois, you will be referred to the proper RIR. And then 3 of the RIRs have incorporated routing information into their Whois directories, and that is AFRINIC, APNIC, and RIPE. So you would see a slightly different output in their Whois than you would from Erin and LACNIC. If, as law enforcement, the most accurate data would typically come from the ISP, they keep more accurate records of who their customers are, who's using the IP address space. And then if, again, for law enforcement, if you do need information that is non-public, that is not in Whois, we would require, all 5 RIRs do require a subpoena or some type of legal order. And the type of information we would typically have that is not public is historical information, corporate officers, corporate documents, perhaps merger and acquisition, paperwork. But most importantly for law enforcement, we have financial data, we have financial records, and that is often what law enforcement uses in their investigations. So that's probably the most important thing we would have that is not contained in Whois. So I want to talk about the RIRs and law enforcement and public safety and how we engage with law enforcement, how we support them, how some of our work directly affects their work. So obviously Whois is the #1 tool that law enforcement uses. They use Whois to identify who IP address registrants are, but they also use it to find jurisdiction and to know where to send their legal requests. We work on data accuracy with law enforcement and the community. They're all part of the community, and that's to improve the integrity, the accuracy. That's done through new policies, procedures, etc. And we have worked directly with law enforcement, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, Europol, and other law enforcement agencies to propose new policies around data accuracy and security. And some of these policies have been implemented by the RIR communities. Obviously, we work in case support. We have our legal experts and our legal liaisons who will respond to subpoenas and court orders, and they will assist in the preparation of any of these requests. Erin particularly does that quite often to make sure that the court orders have the right language and the subpoenas have the right language, and they can be more expeditious if you know exactly what to ask for. And there's also cases where we have turned information over to law enforcement and they've opened investigations, and where they've come to us with open investigations and asked for our assistance. And we do that on a regular basis, in addition to sort of answering questions and calls frequently. Capacity building, again, I'll mention that. We all provide training and information sharing sessions specifically directed at law enforcement. And in fact, the RIRs recently created the Public Safety Coordination Group. And that was established to sort of coordinate law enforcement, our law enforcement and public safety engagement and collaborative activities. So we do a lot of work together. In fact, we just did we are in the process of doing some outreach for Interpol Americas, and Europol, and we've done that together. Additionally, we have tools and resources that are publicly available on our websites, and there's a variety of tools. There's so many things that are there, and they can help fight fraud and abuse. Some examples are right there. Something interesting is APNIC is running a honeypot project where they're sharing their research and data with law enforcement across the Asia Pacific. It's really interesting stuff. RIPE Labs has some very innovative tools and resources. And I mentioned RPKI because I'm going to actually talk about that in a later slide. This is a joint RIR effort. This is Resource Public Key Infrastructure designed to help secure the internet's routing. So I have a slide a bit later. So current trends, this is what we're seeing right now. IPv4 was depleted in 2011 on a global level. So the RIRs have been working with little bits and pieces of their remaining IPv4 addresses. So we've worked since the late 90s to help our communities adopt IPv6. It has been slow but steady. The ISPs are slowly rolling it out. If you look across the 5 RIRs, anywhere from 50% to 95% of our members have actually come to us to get our IPv6, their IPv6 addresses. And so we're also seeing a steady increase in IPv6 traffic globally. At the last time I checked, something like 28% of all traffic being passed on the internet was being passed over an IPv6 network. So it is happening, but it's slow. And so obviously, if IPv6 isn't taking hold like we expected, the demand for IPv4 is still very high. The RIRs receive requests for IPv4 addresses on a daily basis. And that's mostly being done through transfer requests. The RIRs have policies. The RIR communities establish policies that will enable what we call market-based transfers. So in other words, two organizations can find each other out on the market, and one has extra space, they can sell it to the other, and then come to the RIRs and justify the transfer and give us all the information, and we'll make the updates in Whois and keep the database accurate. So obviously, this was done to prevent black market dealings and having a very inaccurate registry. So we're seeing that our customers are turning to the IPv4 market for their address space at this point and coming to us frequently with these transfer requests. So what we've found is that this monetization of IPv4 addresses has led to some increased activity in fraud and hijackings across the 5 RIRs. Which you can expect with the supply and demand of IPv4 not being level. So when I checked last, I think the current market prices said that an IPv4 address was something like $20 to $22. So that is inviting some illegal activity as well as some legitimate activity. So obviously, we have some challenges with this increased fraud. We're seeing more fraudulent requests for transfers. People are submitting completely falsified documentation and trying to pretend to be a registrant that has addresses. We're seeing some black market activity, I guess you'd call it, leasing, buying, and selling of the address space outside of the registry system. And the way they get this routed is they're falsifying letters of authority. That is one way that ISPs will route space. They'll look at an LOA, and they're using falsified ones, which is quite easy to do. We're seeing some hijacking of the IPv4 addresses and autonomous system numbers, mostly the v4. And the way it works at the RIR is that an organization will come in and make fraudulent changes to Whois records in order to take over that registration in that network. And they typically look for dormant, out-of-date records. They're looking for unrouted space. They're looking for expired domain names and corporations that may be defunct. And they re-register all of that and come in and pretend to be that organization. They submit falsified documents. They set up shell companies. They have a whole MO that they are in the process of perfecting. And lastly, we see and hear about a lot of route hijacking, which is the unauthorized use of some abandoned or unrouted IPv4 addresses. And that is often, what we've heard is a lot of spammers do this, and they come in and they get their space routed through these falsified LOAs, and they can cause quite a bit of damage in a short amount of time. So it seems to be a lucrative activity for them. So I wanted to touch on the ways that we as RIRs have been directly involved in helping to keep the internet safe. These are two of the technologies I'm going to highlight. There are others, but these are sort of prevalent right now. The RPKI, it's the security framework. It's designed to secure the internet's routing, and it does this by verifying the association between a resource holder and their number resources. So it will cryptographically certify a network resource itself, an IPv4 address or an IPv6 address, and sorry about that, and it will certify the route announcements themselves, it has this dual aspect. And it is the more secure of these two methods, and that was a cross RIR project. All 5 of the RIRs worked to develop and deploy our PKI. Additionally, the 5 RIRs have been working on a validated internet routing registry. As you recall, an IRR is where organizations put their routing announcements, their directions for how to get from one place to another. And it was typically a free-for-all. Anyone could enter information into an IRR, and the RIRs have worked to add validation mechanisms to the IRR, and that these will guarantee that the routing announcements that you're seeing in the IRR are actually published by the authorized network only. So it is not as secure as RPKI, but it is definitely a step in the right direction. So that, I think, is all that I have right now. I have some follow-up slides that are mostly just referrals to useful links and useful tools that may be of interest to you. But that is it for me. Stephen, do you want to take over?
Yes.
I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Thank you very much, Leslie. So that, and there we have a good insight also into how the regional registries interact with our cyberspace and help make it safe for us. I'm going to invite all our panelists, right, to stay on with the cameras on as we move over into our interactive session. I want to thank our 3 speakers again for the insights that we just had. From Chris Painter, we got the global view, and just some of the key things that I took from what Chris said is that our increased, well, the global high demand and increased usage of the internet infrastructure because of the global crisis, the pandemic with COVID-19, layered on top of our trend towards more technological consumption. All of that is making the whole issue of cybersecurity a political issue, not just a technical issue. And right now, there are critical discussions around what the rules of the road should be. And as we try to find an even better footing inside of this space, and that's happening globally for everyone. Carrie-Ann highlighted, therefore, in that context, what's happening inside of the Caribbean region, and we see a continued trend. I know the OAS has been working for a number of years on helping Caribbean nations stand up much stronger defenses and responses to cyber incidents, and so we see that trend continuing. Still, most of our nations are in the early stages of setting up the what we consider to be some of the better practices and infrastructure and systems and so on, moving into areas of regulation and policies, and that's good. But there's still development that's needed in that area, and we continue to work towards those things. So it really was good to get a peek into where we are today. And then finally, the regional internet registries in the Caribbean, we have both ARIN and LACNIC. They play a key role in how we use the internet, since they're the ones that distribute number of resources, and therefore their ability to see who is using what resource is a key part of working with law enforcement with our fight against criminal activity online, and just ensuring a safe environment. And Leslie was able to give us some insight into what's happening there and how it works. So this gives us a picture of the landscape that we're in, and want to basically have just some open discussion now. We have approximately 40 minutes left in our allotted time, so we have really good time here to have a good discussion at a good pace. We don't have to rush anything, but we can have a conversation around these things. I invite everyone to post your questions in the Q&A. We have one question in the queue right now, which I'm going to pose to Carrie-Ann. And the question comes from Neil Sprott. Carrion, I think most Caribbean countries leave cybersecurity on a national level to police departments. Do you think Caribbean islands should start implementing national cybersecurity officers or CISOs, maybe under Minister of National Security? I guess you can, if you can kind of elaborate a little on that, Carrion, in terms of telling us what some of the recommended structures for those things are, what you've seen, how the OAS has been helping to get some of those stood up.
Thanks for that, Stephen, and thanks for the question. So if you think about how the Caribbean is and some of the threats that we face as like a daily basis, our budgets are usually allocated towards disaster recovery. Being vulnerable as islands, a lot of the times, persons tend to focus on what are some of the immediate challenges that would require remediation for our member states. And I think one of the things that would happen, if you think about cybersecurity, it's often a concept that it's still foreign and new for a lot of people. So when you think about a paper-based island, that their immediate needs are either health considerations, road repairs, there's a hurricane that's threatening, there is trying to fix some of the physical things that affect the lives of day-to-day citizens. Cybersecurity is not usually prioritized because how are the citizens interacting and how are the citizens seeing things? So I think it's not just a matter of Caribbean countries not seeing it as a priority, but it's when you look at the list of priorities you have, where would cybersecurity fall? If I as a government invest $1 million into networks when half of my citizens are not online or they don't access government services online, it's usually hard for them to see a tangible benefit, especially when election is a year from now, 2 years from now. So it is a cycle that we have gotten into, but what I can say is that the countries that have actually seen cybersecurity as an asset to government services and some of the things they want to implement, it has actually worked out better for them because persons think that cybersecurity initiatives at the national level requires a huge budget when sometimes it's just really small actions and activities and coordination that's needed. So as to the specific questions of institutionalizing an entity or a body that's responsible, we usually recommend at the OAS that you give the mandate to someone, whether it be your Ministry of Telecommunications, your ministry responsible for ICT. Under some of our governments, it's national security. On some governments, it's the Office of the Prime Minister. At this nascent stage when cybersecurity is still at a level 1 or 2, I think one of the only expectations we could ask is have it designated to someone. Because having it designated to no one, then nothing will happen at the end of the day. So if it's dedicated under someone with very clear mandates, especially on coordination and awareness raising, which is a key thing in the Caribbean now, I think that will then build into it being an interest for persons to pursue a career. And then once they pursue a career, then you'll have more resources to allocate for technical requirements that the government may have as they roll out digital services. So if you think about it as a holistic chain, it's necessary to start thinking, what is our reality? Be fair on ourselves, and then start working through measures that will improve the overall thinking that cybersecurity is not a foreign concept. It's a part of my day-to-day life. I have a mobile phone that is pretty much a mini computer. How do I protect myself on this device? I have a government that's encouraging me to get my birth certificate. Why is this such a security concern for me when all I needed for is a service? So letting them start to think about their digital identity as an asset, something that needs to be protected. Then as the government rolls out other more technical services, it will become something that becomes a norm. So yes, I believe that a dedicated function needs to be done. We often don't recommend that a Caribbean country instantly think that I need to set up a cybersecurity agency. It's costly. It's costly to have technical persons on staff waiting for the networks to become more active, for incidents to be happening. It's costly to think about it in terms of hiring 10 people to just have an incident response team. Think about it in smaller scales initially, set up the good practices, and then as the need arises and the demand arises for the services, you can increase it. And if I haven't answered it, I can go further.
All right, I think that answered it. Thanks, Karen. Chris,
yeah,
you want to ask a follow-up?
I just wanted to add to that. I mean, I agree with what Carrie Ann said. I think that the issue is there's a couple issues. One, wherever you put it, as Carrie Ann said, it has to have coordinating authority. The aperture has to be larger than just stopping cyber threats, which the police are very good at, especially if they're criminal threats. So the police, and I spent a lot of time working with police over my career, are a great place to have part of this this portfolio. But like any other part of government, they're going to be focused on their mission, which is really to go after criminals. And it's really a broader topic. So partly it goes to that priority issue. If countries don't think about this just as a threat, the threat that are out there that you have to do cybersecurity for, but as an enabler for the kind of digital transformation these countries need and want, and for economy and social values, economic and social values, that helps shift the focus a little bit. So it's not just looking at the threats, but looking at it in terms of the overall country's policy and their economy, which I think is important. The other is whoever has a ticket has to have that coordinating authority. It has to have an all-of-government approach. We found even in the United States, but almost everywhere around the world, that no matter who had the ticket, whether it be the police, a national security agency, an ICT ministry, the Department of Defense in some countries, if they weren't talking to other players, they were going to be ineffective, because other players in the government, whether they be the economic ministries, the ICT ministries, or others, are going to have different perspectives you need to bring together. And the final thing I'd say is that, another thing the police are good at in dealing with cybercrime, but not maybe as good at in dealing with other issues, is you need to have this multi-stakeholder approach. You need to build a coalition where you're talking to private industry, you're talking to civil society in the country, you're building this beyond government. And that needs to be part of the plan too. And a lot of that's driven by the national strategies, and it's good that there are more that are out there. But again, this is still in the early stages, as Carrie Ann said, of development for many of the countries in this region.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Have a few more questions in the queue, but before we get to them, just wanted to ask one question to gets between Carrie Ann and Chris again, related to this. Carrie Ann mentioned in her presentation that the emphasis has shifted a little bit away from counterterrorism as governments look on the medical area and so on. And here we're talking about essentially where the priority of cybersecurity falls within the government's priorities right now. I get the question I'd just like both of you to speak to is we're four months, give or take, into dealing with the pandemic. Have there been any conversations? Have you been a part of any conversations about rebalancing those priorities? We know that maybe a year ago, looking deeply into the cybersecurity issues might not have been the highest priority, but our use of the infrastructure now says it should be going forward. But right now we're trying to balance priorities and get back to some amount of normalcy. Could you just give a quick peek into what the conversation has been like in the most recent days, if you've seen anything move, or this is still something to come? Chris, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I have seen, I think, a shift. Now, whether that shift will be permanent or not, it's unclear. Unfortunately, people look at crises, they get really spun up, and then that goes away after a while. But I do think there's a recognition that this is we're so dependent on these technologies, and particularly, again, I said not just big countries, but smaller countries are so dependent on these technologies that cybersecurity does have greater importance. So I've heard some conversations around the world. I certainly heard some conversations, not just in this region, but in Africa and other regions where, to be fair, cybersecurity may not have been at the top of the heap, and that makes a lot of sense given all the other problems some countries are facing. But they recognize this is intertwined with a lot of those other priorities. Some of the work that's being done by, for instance, the World Bank and others who are thinking, as you look at infrastructure development, you look at other development, that cybersecurity is an important part of that. So I think, the conversations have been there. There have been more conversations at a political level, but it's still a work in progress, I'd say.
And just to continue on from Chris, for the OAS, we have, it's surprising. I think I could say categorically, the Caribbean has been asking for assistance, specifically at the political level, over the past 5 years especially. So in terms of getting their policies organized and capacity building trainings, etc., we've had requests from at least 6 to 7 of our Caribbean member states. And they've been consistent in terms of following through But in terms of this being a shift, I think COVID-19 has had some impact, but I believe generally the shift has not just been prompted by COVID-19. I think as a lot of our member states have been digitizing their services, a lot of them have been going to e-government, whether through IDB loans or World Bank initiatives, and they have seen it as a priority. Right now, we have 3 Caribbean countries we're working on, and they've been very dedicated in doing their cybersecurity strategies. We have Barbados that has been very active, establishing their certs. We have Guyana as well, who's increased their incident response capability, working on their strategy. We have Jamaica, who's looking at theirs again. We have Antigua, who's working on incident response capabilities. We've had St. Lucia, who's asked for assistance in the past. But I think generally, the Caribbean recognizes that while it may not be a priority, it's a necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with that understanding of the necessity, they may have, as Chris said, they may be pursuing it at a time when they do have the energy or have the resources, but we have limited resources. If we have one chief technical officer, that officer is doing all the telecommunication stuff, plus cybersecurity, plus other things. So we have just, I think one of the things I've said to all our member states that have engaged us is, we are here for you when you're ready. Like, and I think that's the only thing you can ask, but I can't say COVID has increased it, because I've seen that there's been a continual increase in interest over the past couple of years.
Okay, great. Thanks, Karen. And before we leave this specific issue of just priorities and balancing priorities, I'm going to ask similar question to Leslie. I know Aaron has been working inside of the region, doing more work with law enforcement and formal institutions and formal work. Could you talk a little bit, Leslie, about what that has looked like over the past period of time, and if you've seen any change in that era more recently?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, in fact, we and Aaron started working with law enforcement directly back in the early 2000s, because we were seeing lots of hijackings and sort of illegal activities, and we started engaging with the FBI frequently. And in fact, I started teaching at the FBI Academy down in Quantico, just really information on how the internet works, how the RIRs come into play, what routing is, et cetera. And as the years passed and that sort of illegal activity started spreading to the other RIRs, they became more engaged with law enforcement as well. And then we started working together sort of on a global level with law enforcement. We have regular meetings and outreach sessions, trainings, as I mentioned. We have our public safety coordination group, where we are doing quite a bit of work together. We are all engaging with the members of the trust community, the anti-phishing working group, the mail malware, MOG is what it's called, and I always forget the 3 M's, so forgive me please, but MOG, with FIRST, which is the Association for Certs and CCerts, and actually some of the RIRs are doing some very intensive work with CCerts and helping facilitate the establishment of CCerts in their regions. So really, public safety has become very apparent. It's something that we as RIRs need to focus on and concentrate on, and we will continue to do that both individually and together. And it seems together we really form a good team. And in fact, we're working also with ICANN, with their SSR people, Security, Stability, and Resiliency people, in our efforts to do this outreach. And ICANN typically focuses on domain name abuse, and will focus on fraud and hijackings and route hijackings, et cetera. But it seems to be very effective in reaching out to law enforcement globally, and we're going to continue this program. Okay,
great. Thanks, Leslie. I think the message we can take from what we just heard from Chris, Kerry, and Leslie is that the inside of the Caribbean region, we certainly have very good, very strong support for movement forward in this area. And as Kerry said, when governments, when institutions are ready, when there's the ability to emphasize this area, we certainly have access to these partnerships to help us to move forward. And that's really a good place to be, because we know that we can be successful in the future. I'm going to ask a question from the CTU Secretary General, Ms. Bernadette Lewis. Welcome, Ms. Lewis. To Kerry-Ann, said Kerry-Ann, you mentioned that there's quite a bit of legislative reform in several Caribbean countries. To what extent has the cyber legislation been harmonized across the region?
While this is not, we don't, FIP itself is not the main person for cybercrime, but I can give you a general sense of what's happening. Some persons may recall all the way back in 2013, 2012, we had the HIPCAR project, and that model had given several Caribbean countries a framework within which to do cybercrime legislation, data protection, freedom of information, and it spoke to data privacy as well. A lot of the countries did adopt that model. Within some of the OAC countries, they had done the eGRIP, which was based on a similar model, but not exactly the same. There are slight differences in the drafting of them. And the institution, so just as a background, Bernadette, is that the OAS does support the Budapest Convention, and with that, REMHA, in association with the US DOJ, promotes the development of legislation along that line in terms of covering some of the key offenses outlined in the Budapest Convention. And we promote the information sharing that is within that framework. So a lot of the Caribbean countries, if you look at the legislation in Jamaica, the draft in Trinidad, the one that was published in Grenada, Guyana, they all have similar offenses. I think where there were some variations, it's minor based on the government's preference. Another thing that should be considered as well is a lot of the Caribbean countries do use mutual legal assistance, and they have similar legislation across the board for that. So that allows the corporation for the investigation of crimes with other partners that they have that legislation that is established there. So I think in terms of what level is their harmonization, I think following those models, there's a fair amount. The only thing is that a lot of them would have had older laws from 2003, such as the Computer Misuse Act. So many of our countries have that one, and not necessarily a cybercrime legislation. So I think that would be the best way to kind of capture that overview. But there has been efforts, and I can say categorically, from REMHA and from other institutions such as there's a project that is called Glassy Plus that is benefiting some Caribbean countries under the EU, the Council of Europe, and they are also working on harmonization. So I know that some of our member states have been participating and working alongside these institutions to kind of up the level of legislation in the region.
All right, thank you, Karen.
Sorry, Stephen, I forgot one other thing. I think one of the things that you guys should look at as well is that CARICOM Impacts just completed a study on this. And I think it's a great resource. If you go onto their website, you may be able to contact the Secretariat at Impacts. And there's actually a study that they did a presentation on, which kind of mapped all the legislation throughout the region. Wow. And it's more updated. I think it's one of the most updated document that would actually have that content.
Excellent. That's actually good to know. So we'll see if we can post the link to the Impacts website and possibly the study in the chat for everyone. Question for Chris. How do we, and this is from Anne Rochelle In, how do we reconcile, who I believe is that Aaron? How do we reconcile global efforts to make them all meaningful at a local level? We know that we have good international law norms from GFCE, ITU, UN, and so on, but a lot of times these aren't known at a regional or local level. So, for example, Chris, having you here as part of this webinar is a good way that we're getting the norms out there. But could you speak to how, what kind of processes and what kind of ways in which we can have those norms dock all the way down to our local?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think that's a really good question, because unfortunately there's a lot going on internationally and it's not really known at the local level. And one of the, I think, big pushes is to make sure that more countries at a country level, at a political level, but also other institutions within countries and civil society and industry and others are aware of these initiatives. And that's one of the big pushes that came out of the UN recently, that many countries noted that a lot of the things that are being done there are not getting as much wide play as you'd like. For instance, I remember giving a speech to the FIRST community, the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, and there were all of the certs from all over the world. And they weren't even aware that the UN had agreed on this don't attack certs, as one of the things they did. Most of them weren't aware, some were. So we're not doing a very good job at doing that kind of outreach that we need to do, because this is not just for people in New York or Vienna. This is really for countries or Geneva this is for countries around the world to operationalize. When we talk about the importance of cooperating against shared threats, that's something every country has a piece of. So I do think one of the things we need to do is to do more of that instilling at the local level. I think part of that is having more of the countries in this region participate in these discussions actively. I think many are, but more should. I think part of it is doing more capacity building to reach out to them. One of the parts of the GFC is dedicated to diplomacy, norms, and international law. And one of the things we've talked about is how do we get more countries into the game? How do we get them to understand what these basic principles are? So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, to be sure. And while I'm at it, I just wanted to note, Bernadette had asked a question, which I think has disappeared, about how folks become involved in the GFC. I posted the GFC website, but I'd also say there's over 120 members and partners. They include governments, about 65 governments, so governments are welcome. International institutions, like, for instance, OAS, ITU, and others, civil society groups, and industry. So there's lots of opportunities to participate, and also to help with this, getting countries to focus on what these international developments really mean at the local level.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. So we can look in the chat for that info, the GFC. Have another question for, I believe this would be for Leslie. Technical question from, well, slightly technical, Nigel Casimir at the CTU. In the Caribbean, is it that there are relatively few ASNs, that's autonomous system numbers, or does the number of ASNs have any relationship to the quality of practice of cybersecurity? You know, as in the availability of expertise, dependence on, a lot of times in the Caribbean region, we don't have institutions getting their own ASNs because we depend on the telecom providers to provide the resources and so on. So what do you see happening there, Leslie, in terms of those trends?
So I'm not really sure I can address this. Actually, Stephen, I bet you could address this better than I could, coming from the CaribNob perspective, because you discussed this at your meetings. But I can tell you that we have made a real effort, an outreach effort, with Bevel Wooding has, in fact, to get to the Caribbean region to discuss, you know, independence from ISPs. Come to Aaron, get your own IP address space, come to get your own autonomous system numbers, set up internet exchange points, et cetera. And he's been providing this outreach and training for very intensely over the past year and a half. So we have seen an uptake, an increase in the number of autonomous system numbers being issued in the region, and in the number of IP addresses being issued, both IPv4 and IPv6. But I cannot speak to the cybersecurity aspect of that. I don't have that information, but maybe you can add to that.
Well, actually, I guess we could tackle the question in a slightly different way. I don't know if you might have some of this info on hand, but I imagine that if we have more organizations getting autonomous systems, getting their own number of resources, then it makes the map of who is using internet resources more granular. So you can see more into it. Is there, so just thinking about that correlation, as we have more organizations getting their number of resources from Aaron, are you aware of any increased collaboration in terms of Whois data, working with law enforcement and so on in the region at all, as we have more, or has it seen pretty much the same?
I haven't seen that in particular. Actually, Bevel may have that more access to that information.
Okay.
Because we've done some outreach to law enforcement. We did a big session with Jamaica last summer, but I don't know if there's a correlation. I'm sorry.
Okay, all right. That's something that we could track down, because I guess not needing to use that Whois data to do research could be because there's not so many incidents going on that we need to research, or it could be that we're just not using that facility. But I know for sure Aaron has, and in your work, Leslie, you have been doing a lot of work to let law enforcement know to collaborate, and so that we have access to these resources.
Can I just maybe add one thing to that? I mean,
sure.
There's been a big debate about this, that, you know, not this region specifically, but that some of the data privacy legislation in the EU affects how Whois might be used or usable and how it might be configured, which is troublesome for law enforcement because Whois is a very valuable tool for law enforcement. I know that when I was a prosecutor, this was used very often. It's not always dispositive, as people know, but it's a very important tool to start gathering evidence.
Yeah.
And can I add, Stephen, to that?
Yeah.
You mind? It's a good point, and it's one I meant to make during my presentation. So yes, the domain name registries and ICANN, working with ICANN, have essentially shut down their access to their Whois data and information. So that was a big tool for law enforcement, particularly in the domain name space, because that's where much of this criminal activity happens. But the RIRs have not done that. So our Whois information is still completely publicly available. Everything is still being displayed. We, our CEOs, our attorneys work together and determine that in order to meet the needs of our community and the direction of our community, we need to keep that information publicly available for network providers, for law enforcement, and for others to be able to understand who is using IP addresses and be able to make things work properly. So I think law enforcement is actually turning a little bit more to the RIRs Whois information because that's all they have. And at least they can find who the ISP is, if nothing else, and find proper jurisdiction. So,
okay, thanks, Leslie. Just to make a note here, in the comments, Kevin Swift, who represents LATNIC, that's the Latin American Internet Registry operating in the Caribbean region. Kevin indicates that there's been no increase in Whois consultations by law enforcement within for LATNIC. So thanks for that information, Kevin. Going to throw a question out, I guess, to the entire panel from Rodney Taylor. Rodney asks, can you speak to the role that telecom providers play in relation to securing national IT infrastructure? And I guess this would be just looking at from your experience to our speakers. What we've observed, should they be regulated, that's the telecom providers, in terms of things like implementing DNSSEC, which secures DNS infrastructure, which is similar to RPKI, how that secures routing infrastructure. Should we look at mandating that telecom providers implement DNSSEC or block things at the gateway? Just looking at different ways in which we can ensure that the cyber infrastructure is a little bit more secure going forward. Any thoughts or comments on that from our speakers?
So I'm not sure I can answer this, but I can add to this.
Right.
From an RIR perspective. So we obviously have deployed and implemented RPKI, and we are seeing a huge uptake. We are seeing all the big guys, the Amazons, Cloudflares, Googles, they are deploying RPKI within their networks and requiring their customers to do the same. Okay. And that seems to be really having an effect on other internet service providers, other providers across the globe, as far as implementing and deploying RPKI and helping to secure routing. So that is an absolute, that is happening, and it's being done sort of independently through the encouragement of the RIRs. We're all providing training on RPKI. We speak at the NOGs, the network operator groups. We do demos and all kinds of things to encourage the use. And we are absolutely seeing sort of almost exponential growth in that area. We also support DNSSEC, because we do the reverse DNS. And what we're seeing is that it is not taking hold. It is a very complex technology, and we just don't see a lot of interest in that. I mean, there's interest, but there's not interest in actually deploying it, because I think perhaps because of the complexity. I'm not sure. Right. You may know better than I do, but sort of that's what I can touch on from those two technologies.
Okay, that's good insight there, Leslie. I guess another way of looking at Rodney's question is just to what extent we can get actors like the telecoms providers to participate in our goals, in our national cybersecurity goals, and so on. So, gonna ask Karen, is there any best practice, or what have you seen in terms of bringing stakeholders like the telecom providers to the table. I know we can engage government and so on, but at some level, the network engineering and the CERT levels and the IXP levels have to play their part.
Thanks, Stephen. Because I was going to actually add something to what add something to the question along those lines. Because when you think about the policy level and coordination level, that's where I think the multi-stakeholder model that I spoke about earlier is critical. When you recognize that nobody holds the entire pie, there's always several pieces of the pie that must be thought through. So when you think about securing your networking infrastructure, carrying all the players at the table to even see what the risks that they're seeing, to see the threats that they're seeing, and then to even ask them for some of the solutions they could implement without regulation. Yes, regulation is a tool that could be used, but what we found most useful is either one, coordinating with them to think about the network infrastructure and protection as a very holistic thing, not just trying to fix one problem, but thinking about cyber risk management as a very holistic approach. So thinking about it from what are the actual risks of a network? Who would be the best players? What would be the best approach? Do I want a reporting network, a reporting mechanism? Do I want a mechanism where it's information sharing, where the person who's actually the regulator can know what's happening? Or is it that you want to just implement baseline standards for everyone across the board? So thinking about it from a cyber risk management rather than just a regulatory perspective is something that we promote, because regulations can fix it, but if you don't have an overall risk management system to know how to regulate or what you're regulating or how the regulation would actually fix the problem, it won't be something that is just immediate. If it is that is something that is extremely expensive for persons to implement or too technical, the regulation won't help you, as Leslie pointed out. But if you have a very robust information sharing platform mechanism with your ISPs, with your telecoms provider, with your regulator, then I find that it works really well. I can give you from a policy perspective in Belize, what was really good when we were doing their national cybersecurity strategy, their Public Utilities Commission was on board, and they were one of the lead partners in doing the strategy. And they were the ones who said, you know what we could do? We could actually issue guidelines to our providers. We could actually implement it in their licenses to help guide. They came up with different mechanisms at different points of the network to be able to coordinate, because as a regulator, they're a coordinator as well, if they want to be. So what they thought about is how can we contribute tangibly? And they thought about raising awareness as well as a key component to this. So the short answer to Rodney's question is regulation is one route to take, but I always believe that consultation leading up to that decision is critical, because then you'll know the best mechanism to get the results that you want.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Karen. I think that's an excellent point on which to start wrapping up our webinar today. That idea of collaboration and consultation across multiple stakeholder groups. This issue of cybercrime, cybersecurity, and what we're ultimately going after here, which is building 21st century government, a new a platform for civil society in the future in the Caribbean region to leverage technology and make it better for our lives. That's something that cuts across sectors, it cuts across groups, requires a lot of partnership and collaboration. And so we're glad that we could have had this this discussion today to touch on just this one small area of it. But coming out of the discussion, we have a much better sense of the level of engagement and partnership and collaboration that is already happening. And we can be encouraged that through initiatives like this, it will continue and we'll build on it. So want to thank everyone, thank our speakers, especially at this moment, and thank everyone for attending the RNCT webinar series. I think the discussions have been very, very valuable and provided us with much more resource to take the next steps inside of this area. Want to use this opportunity to mention the upcoming Caribbean Internet Governance Forum webinar, which we can get more information on the CTU website, www.ctu.int, and social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. And just thanks in general to all of the supporting organizations of this webinar series, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the Internet Society, Latin American Internet Registry, ICANN, Packet Clearinghouse, and of course, Aaron is a partner in this. So thanks everyone again for your interest today, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. You can pick up the recording of this on the CTU website and social media. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, thanks.